A little bit of background on Christine. She graduated with an environmental studies degree from Hobart and William Smith colleges with a minor in economics, and during her time there, she really became interested in the social dimensions of environmental issues, and she was in the honors program there, and part of her honors thesis was focused on sustainable living and eating locally, and realizing that that wasn't really an environmental issue, that there were many sort of social and economic factors that really contribute to sustainable food systems, for example. She studied internationally at doing work in Russia, in Australia, and also in New Zealand, and really took advantage of those opportunities when she was an undergraduate to really expand her understanding of environmental issues. And after she graduated, she worked for Cornell Cooperative Extension in Onondaga County, which is in Syracuse, as many of you know. And she worked there as with the Natural Resources Program as a community outreach educator. And she really gained some experience doing hands-on education with regard to green infrastructure, things like rain barrel workshops, and working with stakeholders directly on practices they could implement to address some environmental issues associated with water resources and natural resource management. And that really extended to her work in her master's, which is focused on urban and community forestry and how to engage residents in stewarding the natural resources that are in their community, and really thinking about that in a very deep way. So it's been a wonderful experience having Christine as a master's student. Her enthusiasm and passion for this is infectious, and she really couples that with a strong intellectual knowledge of some of the sociology of these issues, such as urban forestry. So she's going to be staying on for a PhD, and will be talking with us today about her master's work. Thanks.
Thanks, Shorna. And thank you, everybody, for coming on this beautiful last day of fall break. So I really appreciate that you came to hear me talk about my research. So as Shorna said, I'm here today to talk about my master's research in strategies for stakeholder engagement in urban forestry. Oh, wait. Hold on. So right now, across the United States, many cities are currently expanding their urban forests. So cities highlighted in green are currently planting 1 million trees or more in the next decade or in the next few years. I just want to point out that the city of Sacramento is actually planting 5 million trees right now. So there's a really big push in cities to plant trees. And the cities that are listed here but aren't highlighted are currently planting a few 100,000 trees. And I'll be talking more about that today. So these large-scale tree planting programs will bring numerous benefits to cities and urban areas. Some of the environmental benefits of trees include that they're able to improve water quality and reduce urban air temperatures. There's community level benefits of planting trees in cities and urban areas. Planting trees and having well-maintained vegetation in residential areas has been associated with increased social interactions among residents. And there's also been some research about some of the economic benefits that trees can bring to cities, that they encourage shopping behavior and that they can increase property values. And then finally, there's a whole wide literature in environmental psychology about how visual and physical access to nature has all sorts of individual health benefits. For example, visual access to nature through windows, for example, has been associated with improved cognitive functioning, our ability to pay attention for longer periods of time, and it just helps to create this more restorative environment. So again, efforts to expand urban forests will really help to enhance the livability and sustainability of cities. So today I conducted 3 studies for my master's research, so I'll be presenting as much as I can about each one today, because there's so much. So the first study, I examined the practice of stakeholder engagement by urban forestry practitioners. The second study uses a governance framework to analyze people's attitudes towards urban forest governance and management in cities, specifically in New York City. And then my third study is proposing an ecological model of stewardship, and a theoretical framework for how we can make cities more supportive of stewardship. So moving into my first study, as I mentioned, I conducted interviews with urban forestry stakeholders to really examine what the practice of engagement in urban forestry looks like. So stakeholder engagement is increasingly being used in natural resource management. It's important for engaging stakeholders in planning and management to reduce conflict and to ensure that management decisions are viewed as legitimate by stakeholders. In urban forest, so a stakeholder is anybody who is influenced by or who can affect a management decision, so that includes people or groups. And so in urban forestry, I'm defining or talking about, there's many stakeholders, but today I'm talking about stakeholders including residents, businesses, and property owners. These people and groups live and work in the areas where trees are planted in cities, so they stand to benefit from tree planting activities, but they can also sometimes be negatively affected by the problems trees cause, such as they have to rake up the leaves and deal with falling branches. So these are the types of stakeholders I'll be talking about in this study. And then urban forestry practitioners are people like urban forest managers working at the city government, city foresters, and then it also includes educators and nonprofit organizations or nonprofit environmental organizations who work to engage these stakeholders in tree planting and stewardship. So I'm defining the goal of stakeholder engagement as really getting people actively involved in tree planting and stewardship in their community. And the reason I think that this is an important goal is that engaging stakeholders in stewardship has been found, well, in New York City, there's been some recent studies that have found that trees that exhibited signs of stewardship, so evidence that trees have been pruned, also evidence of signage like curb your dog, respect to this tree type of signs, symbol evidence of stewardship actions like that has been significantly associated with trees that exhibit signs of stewardship have been found to have a significantly reduced mortality rate than trees that don't exhibit these same signs of stewardship. Bringing community members together to engage in tree planting and stewardship has been found to bring people together and strengthen social ties between neighbors. There's been some researchers that hypothesize that these types of actions can bring people together and facilitate the development of proactive groups that are able to address other issues in their community. And then for individuals, stakeholders being engaged in tree planting and stewardship, researchers have found that residents who are involved in planting trees in their community have a greater sense of ownership and more satisfaction with those trees than residents who weren't involved in the tree planting activities. So the literature in urban forestry has highlighted some methods that can be used to engage stakeholders to become involved in tree planting and stewardship. So one of these methods is stakeholder analysis, which is the process of gathering information about stakeholders, their attitudes, interests, needs, their relations to other stakeholders. That's called the instrumental approach to stakeholder analysis. Also, the normative approach to stakeholder analysis is actively soliciting input and the participation of stakeholders in the management decision-making processes. Effective communication has been discussed a lot in the literature in that, so for example, having multilingual promotional materials to hand out to different stakeholders in order to engage a diverse group of people. Education is talked a lot about in terms of holding festivals related to trees and urban forestry, having community arts projects related to environmental issues, and the one that's been most discussed is having tree planting programs and stewardship opportunities that enable people to come out and learn how to plant trees and take care of trees. And lastly, empowerment. And this has been discussed in the literature, in urban forestry at least, as an individual level outcome that results from being engaged in stewardship and tree planting. With empowerment being this notion that knowledge of these larger socio-political issues and that you feel like you can take action and be effective in promoting change. But in the community psychology literature, there's empowerment theory argues that empowerment is a multi-level construct and that it also exists at the level of organizations. So organizations can be empowered in that they are able to affect change in the community, but organizations can also be empowering, meaning that they are able to foster individual level empowerment among participants in the organization. So empowerment is both it's an outcome as well as a process. And there's literature in community psychology about what kinds of Structures can be included in empowering organizations to facilitate individual level empowerment, and I will discuss some of that when I get to my results. So my first research question entails, we know that these methods have been discussed in relation to achieving tree planting and stewardship, but there's hasn't been much research about how these methods are related and what the full process of engagement is. So for example, my first research question is looking at how does stakeholder analysis, for example, influence or inform the other engagement methods that are used. My second research question is looking at, so these are the methods that have been discussed, but how are urban forestry practitioners actually employing these methods and strategies? And then my third research question is, what challenges have these stakeholders faced in their efforts to engage different stakeholders? So in this study, I did semi-structured interviews with urban forestry practitioners that I purposely sampled after attending national urban forestry conferences in the last 2 years. So I identified speakers and attendees that I met who seemed to be able to speak to, or who had experience in engaging different stakeholder audiences. I also used critical case sampling to ensure that my sample included practitioners who are working in these critical case cities of these million tree programs and these large tree planting programs. And I also used snowball sampling to ask the people that I interviewed to identify additional people to interview. So my interview questions looked at what kinds of stakeholders are you working with, what kind of programs do you use, and what challenges have you faced in your efforts to engage these groups. I conducted 21 interviews. I was able to do 2 of them in person and the rest by phone, and on average they lasted about 35 minutes. And for data analysis, I transcribed all of the interviews and used Atlas TI, which is a qualitative analysis software program, to analyze the data. And I used a grounded theory approach in which I read the interviews for emergent patterns and themes, as well as evidence of concepts from the literature relating to the stakeholder engagement methods that I just discussed. So again, I interviewed 21 practitioners. They're all working in different sectors in urban forestry, so most of my sample works for nonprofit organizations, and they work all over the US. So first, the practitioners described the ways that they gather information about different stakeholder groups. And one of the most frequently discussed methods for doing that was going out and attending community meetings with stakeholders. People like neighborhood groups, community groups. And the practitioners talked about the importance of attending these meetings to have personal face-to-face conversations with the stakeholders. And really the goal was to sit and listen to what their needs are, so that later the practitioners can work to convey how their urban forestry activities and programs can be used to meet these needs. So the practitioners identified multiple types of stakeholder groups that they're working with, from schools to government agencies. But this one theme that came up as they were talking about identifying stakeholders was that they work with a lot of people who kind of just fall into their laps. They're already interested in urban forestry, and these people will just call up many of these organizations and say, I want to get involved in your activities. And then other practitioners discussed some of the qualities of these types of self-motivated stakeholders, and it's things like they're ready and they want to make a change in their community, and they recognize that tree planting could be used to better their community. So they really talked a lot about instrumental stakeholder analysis, gathering information about stakeholder groups, but there was some discussion about normative stakeholder analysis involving stakeholders in decision-making around tree planting. And so as this practitioner said, it doesn't work well if you go into a neighborhood and just want to plant all these trees without gaining consensus first about what kinds of trees the community may want. So moving now to communication, another method, a communication method that was used that both kind of relates to the normative stakeholder approach, is like asking people what kinds of trees they want, was this use of canvassing. So a lot of the organizations talked about how they use canvassing in residential neighborhoods to not only ask stakeholders what kinds of trees they want, or do they want to have a tree planted, but they use canvassing also to just inform the community that, hey, we're going to be planting trees in your neighborhood. And as this practitioner said, it seems to matter who is doing this canvassing. Some practitioners said having people from the neighborhood are more effective than having outside canvassers. So a challenge that came up related to communication was something called the low-hanging fruit problem. And more than one practitioner used this idiom to describe how they're really good at engaging the audiences that are really easy to reach. So people who really like trees, who have positive attitudes towards trees, but they're having to, more than one practitioner discussed how they're having difficulty engaging and even communicating and connecting to these harder to reach audiences. And so some of the qualities of these audiences were they're not English speaking, low income, they have negative attitudes towards trees. So this practitioner was talking about this low hanging fruit problem in the context of, I think in her city she had a 250,000 tree planting program where they're really targeting homeowners and property owners to plant the trees. So the problem here is that the first couple 100,000 trees that they plant will be easy because the people who want those trees will be the first to plant them, but then as the campaign continues, they'll have a harder time engaging the people who may not like trees so much. So they do all sorts of educational activities like giving presentations to different stakeholder groups, but a lot of them spoke in depth about their tree planting programs. So these are like, they'll have a Saturday event where neighbors and volunteers and community members can come out and plant trees, and the practitioners try to make sure that people learn how to plant the trees and care for the trees, as well as that they leave understanding what the benefits of the trees are that they planted. So these tree planting programs really become the core activities or the vehicle for empowerment. So many of these organizations seem to have a group of volunteers that are really dedicated to tree planting and they really want to make a difference in their community. So more than one practitioner identified that they provide community organizing training to these stakeholders so that these neighbors can then go and organize tree planting activities themselves in their neighborhoods. And there was also this idea of having neighborhood stewards, kind of training local volunteers to really be the champions and advocates for tree planting and for stewardship in their neighborhoods. So as this practitioner talked about, these stewards serve to kind of use peer influence or peer pressure to make sure that other people in their community are taking care of trees. Another empowering organizational process is social support, really building this sense of community among participants. So this practitioner talked about how they just have social events outside of tree planting and stewardship where people can just come and get to know each other. And this practitioner talked about how he's learned in his work that people participate in these programs because of the relationships that they have with other people, not necessarily because of tree planting and stewardship. So then he talked about how his approach is really to piggyback off of these social relationships that are built to facilitate tree planting and stewardship. So I've touched upon just a few of the major themes that emerged from this interview data, but one of the big ones is that these organizations seem to be really good at reaching out to and connecting with these self-motivated stakeholders. This idea of personal conversations came up both in stakeholder analysis in terms of attending meetings, and it also came up in canvassing as a communication medium. But with canvassing, it seems to matter that it's local volunteers, neighbors doing the canvassing and not outsider canvassers. There was this low-hanging fruit challenge that was identified, so it'll be interesting for future research to analyze how these million tree planting programs progress to really engage these audiences that are harder to reach. And I've only touched upon a few of the empowering processes that I saw within these interview data, so this would be another interesting avenue for future research. But now to move on to study number 2. So in this study, I conducted my research in New York City, where the Million Trees New York City campaign is going on, and I'll provide more background on that moving forward. So here I used a governance framework, and so governing are the activities conducted by government to manage and steer society. But over the past few decades, we've always had governance in democracy, but there's been this shift in our society towards more and more governance beyond the state, where there's more actors outside of government who are given authority to engage in governing activities. So again, it's not just government, but there's other actors outside of government who are engaged in governing activities. And so governance is that pattern of actors who are involved in governing. And so a public-private partnership is an example of a governance arrangement that's often used in urban areas and cities. And in public-private partnerships, governments partner with other organizations they're united in a shared goal, and that the whole idea is that the organizations working together will be more effective at delivering public services than either actor acting alone. So governance has manifested itself in urban forestry, and that civil society organizations like informal grassroots groups, stewardship groups, are playing a really active role stewarding public lands. A survey of 135 stewardship organizations in 6 major cities in the Northeast found that more than 50% of the civil society organizations are conducting their activities on publicly owned land. And then another recent study found that so this study was 135 cities, and 9 out of 10 of those are partnering with civil society to really address education and outreach. So there's multiple actors involved in governing urban forests. But because these civil society organizations often have small, limited budgets and small staffs, they really rely on volunteers to provide the labor that they need to conduct their stewarding activities. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move to my research question number 1, which is, so the research has really looked at what role civil society plays and like what entities can govern urban forests, but I'm really interested in what do residents think that their role is in managing trees in urban forests. These million tree programs are calling for everybody should be involved, that everybody can play a role in managing and stewarding trees. What do residents perceive themselves to have that responsibility, and what role do they think that these other organizations play in urban forest governance? So my second research question are, what are the factors that shape people's beliefs towards urban forest governance? Looking to the literature, I'm proposing that these could be things like attitudes towards trees, awareness towards tree planting and urban forestry programs, degree of previous involvement in stewardship and urban forestry, level of educational interest, a desire to move just from knowing about urban forestry to actually becoming an active steward in the urban forest, and also demographic factors. So these million tree campaigns, in order to reach their tree planting goals, they need to plant trees in multiple different settings within a city. So my third research question is, how do beliefs towards urban forest governance differ at all for trees planted in different settings, such as along a street or along a park, or in a park? So these Million Trees programs are kind of interesting test cases for governance. And so I'm looking at the Million Trees New York City campaign. This campaign is a public-private partnership between the Parks Department and the New York Restoration Project, which is a big nonprofit. This campaign was started in 2007. The goal is to plant 1 million trees by 2017, and they've planted about 500,000 trees already, so they're well on their way to achieving a 1 million tree goal. And again, they're planting trees in multiple kinds of settings throughout the city. So some research has emerged that has already pointed to some of the challenges that are arising in New York City as a result of million trees. So when street trees are planted, they're planted by contractors hired by the city, who are required to take care of the tree, replace it if it's damaged or diseased. They're required to take care of the tree for 2 years following the planting. And then it becomes up to maintenance of the trees becomes the responsibility of the adjacent property owner. But it's unclear whether the property owner knows when that 2-year period ends and when they become responsible for the tree. Also, there's been evidence that a lot of citizens have been complaining about the trees that have been planted in some of these neighborhoods. These complaints are submitted to the city, and then the city can conduct analysis on what these complaints are about. Some of the complaints are related to all sorts of objections to where the trees were planted, like you planted it too close to my driveway, objections to you never informed me about this tree being planted, I don't want it. And some of the legal issues around trees is another big area of complaint, because people are concerned about the sidewalk damage. When tree roots uplift the sidewalk in New York City, it's up to the property owner to fix that damage, and it can be really expensive. So people see these trees being planted and they perceive it as that's going to be something I'm going to have to pay for in the future. So in this study, to answer my research questions, I conducted an in-person on-site survey in 2 neighborhoods in New York City that I'll explain in a minute. The survey, I wanted to talk to as many people as possible, so I identified high foot traffic areas like train stations and post offices and libraries, and I designed the survey to last about 5 minutes in length. The survey was conducted in these different sites at different times of day, as well as on different days of the week. And there were multiple teams of 2 people who were engaged in surveying at any one time. And the majority of the survey was conducted in English, but we were able to do a few in Spanish and some in Russian as well. So my first research site is Canarsie, Brooklyn. Just to orient everybody, this is Manhattan, Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens. So Canarsie, Brooklyn's about an hour from Midtown Manhattan via subway. These are the types of, this survey was conducted in May of 2010. Here's the sites that we surveyed at. We approached about 1,300 people and we had a response rate of 30%. My second research site was in Jamaica, Queens, and the focus on Canarsie was park trees. The focus in Jamaica is on street trees. Again, Jamaica is about an hour from Midtown Manhattan. We conducted this survey in March of 2010. Again, approached more than 1,300 people and had a response rate of 30%. So in having these 2 cases, I'm not using experimental design. Rather, having the 2 cases just is for comparison purposes anyways, just saying, I think there's a difference, but we're not able to attribute any differences to the sites. So the survey questions were similar in both surveys in both neighborhoods, but in Canarsie, the questions were specific to the park, and in Jamaica, it was specific to the street. We had both open-ended and closed-ended questions, and we collected socio-demographic data. In terms of residents, we did not exclude people who didn't live in the neighborhood from taking the survey because we wanted to capture people who may work in the neighborhood or who visit the park. And we also, so in terms of sampling, we approached people who were walking alone because we didn't want groups of people to influence other people's answers to the survey. And we didn't survey people who were walking on their cell phones or had their earbuds in, which a lot of people do that, so we did find some people to survey. And then in order to compare, we weren't able to survey non-respondents, but to see if we had a representative sample, there were 70% of our sample lived in either Canarsie or Jamaica, so we compared that portion of the sample to the most recent census data, and you can see that we were fairly representative in terms of age and gender, and representative for some race categories more than others. So just some background descriptive results. Less than half of each sample of our respondents in each neighborhood were not aware of recent tree planting. Oh wait, I'm sorry. This is the proportion of the sample who said yes, they were aware of recent tree planting in the neighborhood. About 13% of our sample in each neighborhood did have previous involvement in tree planting and tree care. And 60% of our sample in each neighborhood said that they would be interested in learning more about trees in the future. So a very high percentage of our respondents in both neighborhoods said that yes, trees provide benefits. These are the top 10 most reported benefits that people identified, with shade being the most frequently reported benefit of trees reported in either neighborhood. People tended to talk about the basic environmental benefits of trees. They provide oxygen, they clean the air, but people didn't identify some of the community level benefits or social benefits or human health benefits of trees. In terms of problems, 50% of our sample in Canarsie and 60% in Jamaica said that yes, trees do cause problems. The most frequently reported problem was falling branches in trees in both neighborhoods. Also just note that the second highest problem in Jamaica was property damage. And all the problems that were identified seem to be related to maintenance issues and having to clean up after trees. So in terms of who should be responsible for taking care of trees, this was an open-ended question, and we coded the variables to fall into 3 different categories. So you can see that over 60% of the sample in either neighborhood said that it's government's responsibility to take care of urban trees. And government, they could have identified government in general or a specific city agency. Far fewer said that it should be a shared responsibility, either which we coded as they said yes to a government entity and yes to a civil society entity, or they said everybody or everyone or all of us should be responsible. And then far fewer identified civil society as being responsible for tree care. So to examine what factors influence these different beliefs towards urban forest governance, I use binary logistic regression. So these are all categorical variables, and then the government variables were yes or no dichotomous variables. So I use this regression to analyze how their responses to the covariates or the independent variables influences a yes or no response to the dependent variable. I wanted to include tree benefits in these models, but there were so many people that said yes, trees provide benefits, that there wasn't enough variation to run the model with including tree benefits, so I excluded that. So in Canarsie, I found that, that people with previous involvement and with educational interest were less likely to report government should be responsible. In Jamaica, I found that people with, again, with an educational interest were less likely to report government responsibility. For civil society in Canarsie, I found that people with previous involvement were more than 3 times as likely to report that civil society should be responsible. I ran the model in Jamaica, and the civil society model was not significant in Jamaica, so I'm not presenting that. For shared responsibility, I ran the model in Canarsie, and it wasn't significant for Canarsie, but in Jamaica, I found that people with an educational interest in learning more about trees were almost twice as likely than people who weren't interested to report that it's a shared responsibility. So, my results suggest or found that many residents do not think that they're responsible for taking care of trees. This has big implications for these million tree planting programs that call upon residents and property owners to be involved in stewardship. It seems if people don't perceive that they're responsible, we could end up with no one taking the trees because the government may not, city foresters may not be able to tend to trees as quickly as residents possibly could. So education and involvement were significant in more than one model, and results suggest, or more than one regression model, and results suggest that having an interest to learn more about trees, as well as having previous involvement in urban forestry, seems to foster the belief that entities outside of government can be responsible for taking care of trees. So again, suggesting that, well, I'll get to the implications at the very end, but the last conclusion is, again, we don't know for sure because this wasn't using experimental design, but beliefs towards urban forest governance seem to be dependent on different sites or dependent on the setting. I mean, Canarsie Park is fenced in, there's Parks Department signs, there's sprinklers, that people planted the trees, so it seems like a park kind of lends itself to government responsibility, or people perceive that this park is managed by someone. Whereas in a street tree environment, this environment seems to lend itself towards, it's not really clear who planted this tree or who owns the tree. So I think different sites, people may perceive who is responsible for trees differently when they're planted at different sites. So I'm gonna take a break, okay, so moving to my third study, I came up with a theoretical framework to really make urban environments more supportive of stewardship. So this model was developed after I conducted study 1 and study 2, and this really emerged to me after living in New York City and walking by these poor little trees every day on my way to the subway. And here was a 14-story apartment building, and just as the summer went on, these trees became more brown and people weren't taking care of them. So I just began to think about how might this environment be made more supportive to make it easier for people to take care of trees. So as I've kind of talked about before, a lot of previous research has looked at individual level factors that may influence people's ability to, or desire or willingness to go plant trees, things like their attitudes towards trees, their motivations for volunteering to take care of trees. But research hasn't examined what factors exist in this environment that may interact with those individual level factors to influence people's willingness, ability, or desire to go and steward this poor little tree. So my first research question is really looking at what are those factors that exist in this environment that may interact with individual level factors to shape stewardship behavior. So again, do the people who live in the apartment building next to this tree, do they have access to water? That would be an environmental level factor. There may be social factors like behaviors also going on this sidewalk that may influence people's ability or desire to go hang out by this tree and taking care of it. So I did a literature looking at community psychology, environmental psychology, and social ecology, looking at, and so these are the behavioral sciences. They define an environment as the space outside the person. So I know many of us are most familiar with the natural environment, but we also have home environments, work environments, information environments that all contain factors that influence our behavior. And these are all complex systems that have many different factors that all interact to influence our behavior. And there's multiple levels of influence. And so behavior really is a function of the individual and the environment. So we can't fully understand individual level behavior without understanding the environment in which it occurs. So this framework is used in ecological models of behavior, which map out and identify factors in all of these environments that influence a specific domain of behavior. So these models have been used to address tobacco cessation and ways to get people engaged in physical activity and exercise. Then these frameworks are used to inform multi-level ecological interventions, which aim to address changes within these environments, within different levels in these environments that indirectly influence people to change their behavior. So for example, a multi-level ecological intervention for childhood obesity wouldn't just focus on the individual's diet, but it would also introduce changes in their school environment. It would also need macro policy level changes would also have to happen. So again, it's just this idea of changing behavior from multiple angles rather than just focusing on the individual. These are complex systems. There's lots of factors going on here. So an intervention needs to be considered as an event that's introduced within these already existing systems. So it's important that the intervention is community-based and culturally situated so that the intervention sort of becomes embedded within the existing environment. So taking that really brief introduction to ecological models of behavior, I'm interested for my second research question is how can those behavior change frameworks be applied to the context of urban forestry and to begin thinking about what are some of these other factors that influence stewardship. So this is my proposed ecological model of stewardship behavior. There's already a lot going on here, so I'm going to animate this to walk us through the components of the model. And again, this is coming from literature reviews in environmental psychology, social ecology. But this model includes 7 different environments that I argue contain components that are relevant for urban forestry. And so each of the rectangles represent a different level of analysis within each of these environments. And in reality, these settings and environments are overlapping and independent. So these yellow dividing lines are just for visual purposes for the point of pointing out different factors in this level. In the natural environment, you'll notice that these dividing lines don't intersect the natural environment because, at least in community psychology, they haven't included this environment level, and I argue that our actions are always influencing the natural environment in many ways, so this is just emphasizing that the natural environment is present within in some ways in all of these environments. So again, recall that recall that behavior is a function between the individual and the environment. So this behavior level is dividing individual level factors in the middle of the model that I'll present in a few minutes. And then as we move out towards the edges of the model, those are factors that exist outside of the environment. So this level contains stewardship behavior. This is what I've been talking about today, engaging people in different ways in tree planting and stewardship. So behavior settings, I borrow this from environmental psychology. Behavior settings are the physical and social situations in which behavior occurs. Behavior settings are characterized by there's a standing pattern of behavior that exists within the setting, regardless of the inhabitants who are present in the setting. And there's both physical characteristics and social characteristics in behavior settings. So the behavior setting for street tree stewardship would be sidewalks. Sidewalks is a behavior setting. Then the policy environment includes groups or regulations or policies that influence the types of behaviors that can occur in behavior settings. So again, like in the home environment, if you're an apartment building tenant or you're leasing a condo, there may be certain contracts that you have in your lease that preclude you from engaging in certain types of stewardship on the property outside your home. Then we have the natural environment. So here I want to just emphasize that our activities both influence the natural environment, but the natural environment can also influence us to stewardship actions. For example, invasive species, a couple months ago, we had emerald ash borers on its way, and there were volunteers who hung up purple ribbons on a bunch of the ash trees on campus with cards about how to monitor for signs of emerald ash borer. So again, it's just an example of how elements in the natural environment can motivate us to engage in stewardship. It's a two-way relationship. And now going to the individual level factors, the individual level factors include demographics, age, income, gender, socioeconomic status, and then environmental perceptions entail, so environmental perception is the way that we gather, process, store, and recall information about environments. We tend to prefer environments that feel safe, that we perceive as accessible, that we are familiar with, and that are easy to navigate, that foster our understanding. And so this environmental perception level is important because the way that we perceive environments will influence whether or not we engage in whether or not we enter these behavior settings to engage in the stewardship behavior. So I know I've presented a lot, and this model is really messy and complex, and there's a lot going on, but I think there's some interesting avenues for future research. For example, there could be a study looking at how, right, so before I was talking about how it's sort of unclear who is responsible for street trees, and that there's some policies that regulate who is responsible for street trees, but it seems to not be an environment that's easily navigable by people. It's really confusing who is responsible. So future research could look at how these different settings foster understanding of these different settings and how that influences people's ability to engage in stewardship. Again, this model, I'm just proposing this. It hasn't been tested, so future research should really test components of these models. For example, beginning with the behavior settings level, future research could inventory what is available in each of these environments, what resources are available to engage in stewardship. So again, I think in thinking about how this relates to tree planting, these large tree planting programs, we have to move on beyond to considering the factors that exist in the sidewalk that may influence people's ability to go engage in stewardship. And like I said, these models haven't been applied to the context of stewardship, so I think that future research could see if these models and approaches to behavior change could be effective in an urban forestry context and not just in public health. So my big discussion and conclusion about summing all of this up, after doing all this research, I really think that these million tree programs need to have more direct engagement of property owners and residents and stakeholders before the trees are planted, because I think they're missing a lot of opportunities for more meaningful engagement and more community level outcomes than just planting these trees. As I learned from the practitioners that I interviewed, this idea of having local trained volunteers canvassing their neighbors could be more effective for fostering this sense of peer influence, like my neighbors are planting trees, maybe I should plant trees too. And again, I think this idea of action competence is in environmental education, it's this idea of building up our skills and experiences to participate as citizens in democracy. And I think that there's a lot of, by just planting trees without meaningfully engaging the property owners really kind of misses the opportunity to develop some of these more negotiating skills and communication skills that can really foster people's ability to engage in community issues outside of urban forestry and tree planting. As I saw in my second study, this idea that fostering educational or creating programs that generate interest for people to participate and providing really fun and engaging ways for people to participate in urban forestry, I think my results suggest that's important for really fostering this belief that people can recognize that they have a role in urban forest governance and management. And lastly, I guess, in moving towards sustainable urban forest governance, I think that in order to achieve that, well, one, it's a hard variable to measure. I tried to measure it in my study, and there's all sorts of different combinations of actors that can be involved in urban forest management, but I think until residents are given more engagement in tree planting decisions, and until they recognize that they play a role in urban forest governance, I think there's a lot of opportunities for future research. So before I end, I just want to thank my committee, the Human Dimensions Research Unit, for reviewing many earlier drafts of my ideas and my papers. I want to really thank my colleagues at Cornell Cooperative Extension in New York City, one for hosting me while I lived in New York City. They also helped to conduct a lot of the research and develop ideas. And there's a lot of fellow Cornell students who helped out with data collection and analysis. And I just want to acknowledge that I've received some funding from the Idelson Foundation and the Garden Club of America to do my research. So I know I went through a lot in 40 minutes. I'm at 43 minutes. So, I'd like to open it up for questions because I know I went through everything really quickly. So.
Christine, I really liked your presentation. I thought you explained things clearly. I had a question about the diversity of trees that are being planted and whether people in these different neighborhoods value specific tree species differently. And I noticed in one place you mentioned that fruit was a problem,
Right.
and I'm interested in fruit trees, so I was wondering if some of these attitudes toward trees differ culturally.
I think they would, or there's research to support that they do differ for different street trees. So first, for the fruit question, I think from my knowledge of people's complaints, it seems like ginkgo trees produce fruit that are really smelly, so that might be a fruit that people don't want planted. And I believe they're not planting ginkgo or female, whatever ones produce the fruit. I believe they're not planting those because of people have complained. And then your other question was about different cultural attitudes towards different tree species.
Right, whether that could emerge from
Yes.
deeper engagement.
Yes, so I wasn't able to include this in my thesis research, but I did conduct focus groups in both of these neighborhoods. And in Canarsie, there had been a lot of renovations done to the park, and the Parks Department removed tree of heaven, is a tree species that I guess the Parks Department used as invasive, but that there used to be the Canarsie Indians, were a Native American tribe that lived in Canarsie in the 1800s. So this tree has a cultural value to Canarsie, and there seemed to be, the people in the focus group talked about how they weren't involved in the decisions to remove a lot of the trees in the park, to renovate the park. And so it seems like, yes, it does play an issue. And that's just one, I guess, short story about how there's definitely cultural values associated to trees. And I saw that in the focus group data that I did. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Christine,
Yeah.
first, thanks for a really nicely put together presentation. I guess the question I've got, I know it's a question or observation, but anyway, I was trying to follow back and forth between how you use, with reference to the folks, the stakeholders,
Right.
how you're using the term governance
Right.
versus management, right, versus stewardship. And
Right.
and I found myself, I don't know, you know,
Right.
what you mean here. So, anyway, help enlighten me a bit on how you use that. Please.
Well, as I was practicing my presentation yesterday, that same question occurred to me. So I've been struggling with it since yesterday, so I've been thinking about it. So I think management, in the way that I've been using it, is really taking care of these trees in terms of pruning trees, making sure trees get water. Although now that I'm thinking about that, might be stewardship. The way that I'm talking about stewardship is residents and property owners going out and watering trees and monitoring trees. So then I think management would be sort of the big picture urban forest ecosystem, making sure that we have diverse trees that can support local wildlife. And then the issue of governance, which is very similar to management. I think I'm defining governance as more how people, it's more like the responsibility. Who is responsible for governing? because everybody can be involved somewhat in management stewardship, but governance is sort of the more official, who has authority to do what, or, so at least, it's a very interesting question, but for now, that's how I'm thinking about it. Yeah.
So, in your first study, you were doing a sort of survey of practitioners, and then in your second study, you were talking about it wasn't an experimental design.
Right, right.
So have you thought about how to make your surveys more representative and how to develop an experimental design that will be
Yes.
sort of correct?
Well, the first about the representative of the sample, the biggest thing I would change if I were to do this survey again was to have more multilingual surveyors. Because we just weren't able, these two neighborhoods were very diverse, and we just weren't able to communicate to many people when we said, oh, do you want to take care of trees? Many people said, I don't speak English. So that's how I would address the representativeness of the sample. And then in terms of experimental design, these neighborhoods are very different, like different demographics, different median incomes. So I think if I were to do an experimental design, I would first choose 2 sites that were very similar on some indicator, very low. So I haven't fully thought through it, but I know that because our 2 sites were very different demographically, we just weren't able to use experimental design, but more as just comparative case study.
When you started off, through the question you asked if they were sort of interested in trees,
Mhm.
and sort of proceeded from there. Do you think that affected who was willing to talk with you versus who wasn't?
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting experience doing the data, talking to people out on the streets. So I guess you're asking about how our questions might have influenced the types of people. Well, one, we were all wearing Cornell polo shirts and Cornell aprons. So I think, and this was around the time that Cornell was in the Sweet 16. So for some people, they wanted to come and talk to us. But for other people, I don't know, when I was out there in the street, I kind of felt like I was sticking out like a sore thumb, and that people, oh, she's from Cornell, she doesn't, I don't know, it was an interesting experiment, just being out in the street. So future research would have to address that issue. Maybe the Cornell aprons weren't such a smart idea.
Well, just as a follow-up on that, so I think, Pat's comment is her observation is pretty on point in terms of, inadvertently, one has to be careful about inadvertently screening.
Right.
Because people can walk away.
Right.
And so, the extent to which that first question, that opening question would be interested in, have essentially served as a screening device inadvertently.
Right.
Is one to really consider in terms of the representativeness that we have.
Right.
Over in also people's.
Yeah.
So I think we would need to think about whether, that's in the future, whether that's the best entree.
Right.
That's the topic, whether that's the best entree.
Yeah, there were a lot of limitations with the method that we used to sample, but I think I chose this method because I just wanted to talk to as many people as possible, and I thought that the best way to do that was to just stand on the streets and pretend to say, hey, you want to fill out a survey about trees, and try not to be biased in who I was approaching. Again, I mentioned we didn't approach people in groups or talking on their cell phone or who were running in a hurried manner. So yeah, I definitely recognize, reflecting back on the method, that there were a lot of limitations. Yeah.
Christine, I know you submitted these papers for
Well,
publication.
one of them.
They're on their way there anyway, which is
Mhm.
great. I'm curious if you thought about some kind of publication that would be directed to the urban foresters and
Mhm.
practitioners, and what sort of nuggets you're thinking of focusing on, if you will do that.
Well, so a lot of so I've looked at the urban forestry literature, which is the Journal of Arboriculture, Urban Forestry, Urban Greening, seem to be really practitioner oriented there. So I think, I would like to share my results with that field. And so in terms of big takeaway nuggets for these audiences, I think acknowledging that it's not just as simple as going out and conducting key informants. It's not as simple just doing focus groups. And I would say that because when I was working in New York City with Extension, I saw them having a lot of trouble just identifying people to talk to. So I think haven't fully thought about it, but I would, like in Journal of Arboriculture article, I would talk about just acknowledging that it's not so simple, but here is what other practitioners have found to be successful. Another thing I didn't mention, for example, was a lot of these organizations use door hangers. Like as they're canvassing, they'll leave door hangers on for people who aren't home, and those door hangers include, if you're interested in trees, call me. If you have a problem with a tree, call me. They talked about using those door hangers as ways to test messages. Like they would implement door hangers in this one neighborhood, and then they would measure how many calls they got after the door hangers went out. So things like that haven't been talked about in the literature, but these practices that have been effective for other practitioners. So, any other questions or general discussion, I guess?
Well,
Yeah.
could you, this is a very complicated set of studies that I understand are introductory and an entree into further work for you and others, but if you had to answer the question for scholars and for managers and practitioners you talked about, what's the most important thing you discovered in this research that we didn't already know? What would you say to those two audiences?
That we something that we didn't already know for practitioners and for
Yeah.
stakeholders.
And if you want to remove the we and replace that with I, what you didn't already know, you can do that. But
Well, I guess what I didn't already know, and maybe, I don't know. What I didn't know, and that was really surprising to me, was how many people don't like trees. And so, and I mean, I knew
including
that.
my mother-in-law.
I know, my
She
landlord.
lives on Staten Island, and she does not want a tree anywhere near her house.
Right,
And she's scared to death it's going to fall on her.
right, yeah, exactly, and that came up, that definitely came up. The practitioners talked a lot about their challenges dealing with people who don't like trees. So I guess, in the interview, I don't know how to answer this question, but what I want to say, kind of related, getting at that, is in the interviews that I did, the practitioners were really well informed about all the research that has shown that these are all the benefits of trees, that trees reduce crime, that they have all these mental health benefits, that they increase property values, and they were very well versed in listing off the huge list of benefits of trees. But then the people that they were talking to could care less that trees reduce crime. They were more concerned about picking up the tree. So I think this scholar versus practitioner, and then my own experience, that people don't like trees, and that perhaps practitioners may be putting too much, I don't want to say importance, but like too much emphasis on what the research says the benefits of trees are, and that seems to be very different than what people's everyday experiences with trees are. So I think it's a fine line, and I don't know how the scholar audience would address that versus,
Yeah.
but the practitioner audience, I think, could, just be, I mean, they're the ones working with people on the street, and just, there was also evidence in my interviewees that some of them seem to that's ridiculous, people don't like trees. What do you mean you don't like trees? So I think there needs to be a little more respect maybe among practitioners that people don't like trees. So that's my initial answer to your question. So, yeah.
So did you have any situation where people actually owned the space that the tree was located on, or were in some of the street?
Right. That was something we talked, so I worked with cooperative extension educators to do this survey, and we talked about how we could make this better in future reference research. And we weren't, so the one person that may have owned the property was like a bar that I was standing outside of, and I surveyed the guy who was at the bar. But I think if for future research, I would like to ask, I think what might have influenced people's opinions towards trees was whether they were a property owner or like a tenant, an apartment building tenant. So again, we just weren't able to capture some of these other variables that I think influence people's attitudes because we wanted to do such a quick survey. But again, I think that some of those factors would be interesting to survey in the future research. Yeah.
So you plant trees that are specific to the sites, so if you have
I mean, drought problems or
Mhm.
high winds, or, I mean, do they take all that into consideration?
Yeah, so there's a whole host of urban foresters working for the city, and they do, I'm not well versed in the science behind urban tree planting, but I know that they do conduct site assessments, both looking at, I mean, if there's buildings, then maybe they may need to plant a tree that could be better for a shade environment or drought, like you said. So again, I'm not an expert in like the science of tree planting, but I know that there is a lot of site assessment that goes into where these trees are planted.
And that's done by by the managers, not the stewards?
Yeah, I believe it's, yeah, so in felt like I didn't have time to mention this, but in New York City, majority of the street trees are planted by contractors hired out by the city, because for sidewalks, they need to dig out a huge portion of the concrete. So it's like these, people who have a lot of credentials in tree planting, who do the sidewalk tree plantings. And then for the park trees, that's where they're involving more volunteers, because a natural area, they don't need heavy equipment to plant all the trees. Yeah.
I'll just ask a devil's advocate question about governance.
Mhm.
Because one of the things you found in your first chapter was that people are engaging those that are most easily engaged, the people that are motivated, that show up, that want to work. And so is that okay? So do a larger proportion of residents need to be involved, or could the motivated few, are they representative of that larger group, and maybe it's okay
Yeah.
that only the motivated people are showing up, because that's who's going to
Mhm.
actually take time to
Mhm.
volunteer.
I think, so as I mentioned earlier, that there's all these social benefits that can result that result from people working together to steward trees and to plant trees. And I think it's important that we understand who those benefits are accruing to. And I know at least there was a recent study that came out, too late to really include in a lot of my research, but that found that the people who are volunteering in Million Trees programs are from a neighborhood outside of where the event is occurring. So then it seems like those benefits may be accruing to those people, but that they're not stuck behind in the neighborhood after those volunteers leave. So I think it does matter that, like, where the engaged audiences are from, and that they ideally would be from the neighborhood. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it does matter.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks so much, Christine.